Shri Narendra Modi.
मैं नरेंद्र दामोदर दास मोदी.
On the morning of May 16th, 2014, a particular silence descended upon India. Before the final tally was even announced, everyone knew something irrevocable had happened. The Bharatiya Janata Party, led by Narendra Modi, had won a clear, solitary majority in the Lok Sabha. The first time any single party had achieved this in 30 years. The last such mandate in 1984 had been a convulsion of grief after Indira Gandhi's assassination. This one was different. It was, its champions declared, a positive mandate. A people moving towards something, not merely fleeing trauma. They called it the second independence. 12 years have now passed. It is time to look steadily at what was promised. In documents, in speeches, in the imaginative world the campaign constructed, and at what has come. The first manifesto, a constitution against history. To understand the second independence, one must first understand what the first one meant. The most faithful document of that meaning is the Constitution of India, which came into force on January 26, 1950. Drafted by freedom fighters traumatized by partition, colonial humiliation, and the ancient wounds of caste, it was a manifesto of extraordinary ambition. It promised a republic, a res publica, a public thing belonging to all citizens equally. It promised a parliamentary system designed to prevent the concentration of power in any single hand. It promised federalism, equality, not merely formal but substantive, with reservations for scheduled castes and tribes. The rule of law, secularism, the equal distance of the state from all religions, and welfare as a directive principle of state policy. This manifesto was honoured imperfectly across the 6 decades after 1947. There was the emergency, 1975 to 77, episodes of state-facilitated communal violence, 1984, 1992 to 93, 2002, massive corruption and the persistence of caste hierarchy. Yet the direction was never in fundamental question. The Constitution was the standard against which failure was measured. The press remained broadly free. Elections remained broadly fair. The judiciary struck down laws. The system muddled through, imperfectly but unmistakably, toward the values the Constitution had promised. The 2014 Manifesto. What was written? The BJP's 2014 election manifesto, Ek Bharat, Shresht Bharat, One India, Best India, is striking not for its radicalism, but for its strategic moderation. It condemned the preceding UPA decade as a decade of decay, a charge that was not invented, given the corruption scandals of the time. It promised transparency, accountability, e-governance, and a revival of center-state relations. It promised to empower Waqf boards, promote Urdu, modernize madrasas, and establish a permanent interfaith consultative mechanism. These were words designed to reassure the undecided voter, the urban middle class, and the international observer. But the manifesto and the campaign spoke in entirely different registers. The campaign, the speeches, the rallies, the slogans, was addressed to a different audience. Modi's most famous formulation, "Achhe din aane wale hain," good days are coming, invited voters not to evaluate a program, but to make a wager on a man. 60 years of failure on one side, 60 months of redemption on the other. This compressed history into a binary transaction. The black money promise that 15 lakh crore rupees sitting in Swiss banks would be brought back and each citizen given 15 lakh rupees was a promise of breathtaking specificity and complete impossibility. It was the perfect encapsulation of the campaign's logic. A strong man with the right intentions could achieve what 60 years of weak, corrupt leaders had not. The reckoning. 12 years of broken promises. 12 years is long enough for the gap between promise and performance to stop being deniable. On federalism, the manifesto promised that chief ministers would be genuine partners. What followed was the most aggressive centralization of power since the emergency. The GST became an instrument of fiscal coercion. Governors appointed by the centre were used to topple elected state governments in Arunachal, Uttarakhand, Manipur, and dramatically in Maharashtra. The Interstate Council and National Development Council were allowed to lapse. On institutions and rule of law, the CBI and Enforcement Directorate became instruments of political enforcement, with a pattern so mechanical that it earned the name washing machine politics. Those who joined the BJP found their records cleaned. The Bhima Koregaon case became the decade's darkest illustration. Academics, lawyers, and the elderly Jesuit priest Father Stan Swami were arrested on fabricated charges. Swami died in judicial custody in 2021, denied even a sipper cup for his trembling hands. He was never tried. The electoral bond scheme, struck down by the Supreme Court in 2024, was corruption systematized. Companies that received government contracts became disproportionate donors to the ruling party. On corruption and black money, the 15 lakh rupees per citizen never came. What came instead was demonetization in November 2016. Overnight withdrawal of 86% of India's currency. Over 99% of the notes returned to the banking system. The costs were borne entirely by daily wage laborers, small traders, and farmers. Over 100 people died queuing at bank branches. What demonetization revealed was not a war on crony capitalism, but its consolidation. By 2024, India's top 1% held more wealth than the bottom 55% combined. On employment and the economy, manufacturing as a share of GDP declined. Youth unemployment touched 40%. The NSSO employment survey, showing the highest unemployment in 45 years, was suppressed until after the 2019 election. Members of the National Statistical Commission resigned in protest at political interference. On secularism and minorities, here the gap is not a failure of delivery, but a reversal of direction. The Waqf Amendment Act of 2024 did the opposite of empowerment. Urdu medium schools lost funding. The interfaith consultative mechanism was never even attempted. The Citizenship Amendment Act of 2019 made religion a criterion for citizenship for the first time in Indian history, explicitly excluding Muslims. The Ram Mandir consecration in January 2024 placed the Prime Minister at the center of a ceremony treated as a national event of the first order, an unambiguous statement that the secular republic had given way to something else. The Standard account of 2014 is a story about a party winning an election. It is radically incomplete. What happened was a change of the governing class, the deep stratum of people who staff institutions across time. And this change had been in preparation for 99 years. The Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, RSS, founded in 1925, is older than the Republic. Its strategy has never been primarily electoral. It has been a war of position. The patient, decades-long effort to achieve cultural and institutional hegemony. Through its network of shakhas, daily local assemblies, reaching over 60,000 locations and millions of participants, and through its affiliated organizations, the trade union, BMS, the student wing, ABVP, the temple network, VHP, the school system, Vidya Bharati, with over 12,000 schools. The RSS built a parallel civil society. When the government after 2014 needed vice-chancellors, police commissioners, regulatory board members, it did not have to search. The Parivar had been producing candidates for these positions for decades. Nowhere is this more visible than in India's universities. The appointment of RSS-affiliated candidates to lead the IITs, IIMs, central universities, and the Indian Council of Historical Research has reshaped curriculum. The Mughal period has been removed from NCERT school textbooks. Hindu scriptural concepts have been introduced into the science curriculum. The message to India's academic community that independence of thought is incompatible with institutional survival has been received and understood. The second independence built a surveillance architecture that any authoritarian state would recognize. Aadhaar, the biometric identity system covering 1.3 billion people, was linked to mobile phone numbers, bank accounts, and tax records, creating a triangle of identity, communication, and money controlled by the state. The Pegasus spyware revelations showed the phones of journalists, opposition politicians, and activists targeted. Facial recognition technology was deployed at protests. The Digital Personal Data Protection Act of 2023 exempted the government from its own provisions. The surveillance state is not an accident. It is a considered architectural choice that will outlast any particular government. The pandemic accelerated everything. On March 24, 2020, the Prime Minister announced a complete lockdown in 4 hours. There was no consultation with states, no plan for the tens of millions of migrant workers. The largest forced migration since partition followed. Hundreds of thousands walked home. Some died on the roads. The emergency powers assumed during the pandemic, centralized control over public health, suppression of excess mortality data. The WHO estimated actual COVID deaths between 3.3 and 6.5 million compared to the official 500,000. Were never fully rolled back. The emergency became the new normal. What the second independence really was. 12 years on, we can answer with more confidence than the anniversary's partisans would prefer. What was the second independence? It was not a liberation of the poor from corruption and misgovernance. The poor remain poor. Inequality has deepened dramatically. Corruption has been restructured from petty extortion to grand larceny of policy capture, with the electoral bond scheme as its formal architecture. It was not a liberation of states from the centre's authority. Federalism has been operationally hollowed out even while its textual provisions remain unchanged. The most sophisticated kind of demolition, leaving no rubble to point to. It was not a liberation of institutions. The RBI, CBI, ED, Election Commission, statistical agencies and press have all been weakened, politicized or silenced. India fell from 140th to 161st on the World Press Freedom Index. What the second independence was, and what 12 years of evidence makes unmistakable, was the liberation of Hindu nationalism from the constitutional constraints that the first independence had imposed upon it. Not merely through laws or intimidation, but through the patient replacement of the governing class that interprets those laws, the surveillance architecture that tracks dissent, and the emergency powers that the pandemic normalized. This is what BJP leaders mean when they call May 16, 2014 the second independence. They mean that India was freed not from a party, but from a constitutional settlement, from the Nehruvian idea that the secular, pluralist republic was India's authentic political form. The first independence delivered India from British rule. The second delivered it from that idea, toward the vision articulated by RSS ideologue M.S. Golwalkar. A Hindu nation where minorities must learn to respect the majority and live in a spirit of service. The Constitution of India, the manifesto of the first independence, is still in force. Its words are unchanged. The preamble still opens with, "We, the people of India, solemnly resolve to constitute India into a sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic." These words have not been amended out. They sit in stone, accessible to every citizen, invocable before every court. But a democracy's health is not reducible to the survival of its constitutional text. It depends on the institutions that give that text life. Institutions now staffed by the Parivar's cadre. It depends on a citizenry that can organize. A citizenry now surveilled by an architecture that makes organization visible and costly. It depends on an emergency remaining an exception that the pandemic has converted into a norm whose reversion has been incomplete. The first Independence's manifesto was written by people who had lived through colonization and partition and still chose to imagine the possibility of a just, secular, federal, democratic republic. They made that choice against the evidence of human nature as it had just displayed itself. The Constitution was not a description of what India was. It was an argument about what India could become. That argument is not yet lost, but it is losing. The question now is whether seeing clearly is enough to change course, and whether the institutions and the people through whom a course correction would have to flow retain enough integrity to make it possible. The first independence promised India to all its people equally. The second independence has delivered it, in practice, if not in law, to some of its people more than others. That is not liberation. It is a different kind of subjugation, wearing the face of the liberated, staffed by the cadre of the patient, watched by the eye of the state. The hope is that the seeing is not too late. The risk is that the architecture of the unseen is already complete.
देश दुनिया की रखी खबर
हर रोज हर शाम
कानो कान
सुनते रहें द लेंस पॉडकास्ट।
रही अपडेट लेंस के साथ।